I'm in Medmenham camp, next to the Dog and Badger in the village of Medmenham in Buckinghamshire. This is a Iron Age hill fort, although it may have been constructed earlier than that. The hill fort's constructed on a geological spur that overlooks the River Thames below to the south. Its prominence in the landscape was probably really attractive to human settlers from a very early time, and indeed there have been Paleolithic hand axes found nearby and flint tools from the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. Sometime in the later Bronze Age, probably between 1000 and 700 BC, people constructed earthworks to enclose the top of this spur. The views to the Thames would have been considerable. There wouldn't have been the kind of tree cover that we have here now. The artist's impression of what life was like here at Medmenham Camp in the Iron Age shows a hill fort filled with roundhouses, although that's a little bit of artistic license that we've taken. There's not a lot of evidence for settlement within the hill fort, so it's possible that it was only used for stock enclosure or maybe as a lookout point over the river. The earthworks and ditches are in very good condition on the west side of the hill fort. On the eastern side, they've been ploughed out over the last few centuries, but you can still see them very clearly both on LiDAR and on aerial photography. Particularly on the aerial photography, you can see the dark line of the ditch in the ploughed field. Medmenham Camp is classed as a univalate hill fort, which simply means one wall or one circuit of earthworks and ditch. But at the northwest corner of the hill fort here, the LiDAR shows quite clearly, and you can see on the ground, a small section of a second earthwork. Without dating, it's hard to say whether the outer earthwork is contemporary with the inner bank and ditch, or if it was added as a later enhancement to the site. Hill forts in the Chilterns were constructed any time between that late Bronze Age period right the way through to the end of the Middle Iron Age, around 300 to 200 BC. Less than a kilometre downriver is another hill fort site called Danesfield Camp. That was probably constructed somewhere around 300 BC, so at the end of that hill fort building period. Whether Danesfield Camp and Medmenham Camp were inhabited and used at the same time, we don't know. You can see from the artist's reconstruction that we've taken the decision to depict the two sites as if they were still in occupation and being used at the same time, but we don't necessarily know that that's true. If they weren't occupied at the same time, then that means Medmenham Camp probably was abandoned sometime around 500 BC, but again, we can't be sure of that date. What we do know is what happened later on. A geophysical survey of the interior of the hill fort, conducted by what is now the Marlow Archaeology Group, discovered the remains of what's probably a banjo enclosure. These are a particular type of earthwork enclosure that usually date to the very latest Iron Age and were probably used as stock enclosure. So even if the site was abandoned much earlier, people have come back up here to use it, and it gets used over and over again through the centuries. It was thought at one point that there was a Norman castle here, and for a long time it was called Bolbeck's Camp because people thought this was Bolbeck's Castle. Bolbeck's Castle, however, has now been discovered, and it's 35 kilometres away, near Whitchurch. For the last few centuries, the eastern side of the hill fort has been used for agricultural purposes, and the western side covered with trees. The features I'm standing in now may look like ancient earthworks, but they're actually 19th, 20th century chalk extraction pits, which were probably used to get building materials. You can learn more about this hill fort, Danesfield Camp downriver, and all of our Chiltern hill forts by visiting the Chilterns Conservation Board website.